Isn't that awesome? That was simply Sfat singing a nigun from Uman. Not going to make it to Uman this year. That's a massive gathering every year in Uman, Ukraine for Rosh Hashanah. I think they're still going to gather, certainly not the numbers that we would normally get. I really miss it, but that carries a little bit of the flavor of Uman. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this fine Wednesday evening? Stephen Geger says shalom from Dover, New Hampshire. Yehudit Sobel says shalom from Florence, South Carolina. Brandon Christian Sullivan from Knoxville. Melissa Itel Jurin from Great Neck, New York. Ed Berg from Galloway, New Jersey. Annie McGregor, I know, is in Michigan. Monica Weich. Shalom from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Sharon Frant Brooks with 2 exclamation points from Lebanon, New Jersey. Nancy Brandemel right from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Lucy Ram Johnson from Minneapolis. Edward Cohen says shalom. Patrice Carter says shalom and excited to be here. Linda Pennington, Annapolis, Maryland. Rose Balzerini says shalom from Pioneer, California. Kathy Smith in San Antonio, Texas. A.B. Hirsch from Mexico, Ellen Berenger from Wilmington, Delaware, Stephanie Marie Diaz says Shalom Aleichem, Susan Hicks from Round Rock, Texas, Curtis Bennett from Jacksonville, Florida, Amy Kulesa says Shalom, good evening from Maryland, Ivan Isaias from Mexico, and Hannah Rivka from Charlotte, North Carolina. Over on the YouTube side, Marjorie Holler with us from Virginia, and Neil also from Virginia. All right, we've got some excitement in store for us this evening. First, let's start with a dedication. Our learning tonight is dedicated by Yehudit Sobel in honor of Moshe Avigdor Ben Meir HaKohen. A beautiful dedication. And also I'm dedicating it to my grandmother, Sarah Bat Golda. Yesterday was her yahrzeit. Okay, so yesterday, so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to take a beautiful journey in Talmudic logic, and it's really going to touch on property rights, what's possible to do on our property, what's not, how we can make things possible in our property. And we're going to see, that sometimes the law comes into our domain and tells us what we can and can't do in our property. It's different than zoning laws in the modern world, but we'll see that there's a relationship. But the real beauty of this journey is going to be in how our sages take one step after another in helping us understand what we're doing. Okay. Yesterday, we established that a karpef, this is going to be an enclosure that is not the courtyard of a dwelling. It's not a pen for animals or a stable. It's not the backyard. It's not the front yard of a house. It's some other kind of enclosure. And we've been talking about a field sort of outside of town that is a place where people grow something even though they live inside the town, and maybe it's at some distance from the town. So yesterday we established that such an enclosure, let's say it's designed for storage or for a garden, we're permitted to carry in it on Shabbos if its size is less than 5,000 square cubits. Where do we get that measure? From the measure of the courtyard of the tabernacle in the wilderness. That courtyard was 100 cubits long by 50 cubits wide. That's 5,000 square cubits. A cubit in Hebrew is an amma. So we're talking about square amos, right? So 5,000 amos, square amos, is the maximum measure that such an enclosure could be. And we could still, if it was properly enclosed with good partitions, then we could carry within that enclosure on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said that such an enclosure would need some kind of a watchman's hut or an actual dwelling within it to permit carrying. Rabbi Yehuda said it would need at least a water source or perhaps a cave or even a ditch for us to be able to carry there, so that it would be somehow more connected to dwelling and to residence, right? The idea that there's a water source there makes it more like that a person might, live there in some sense. But as we learned from Rabbi Akiva, no, we don't need any such thing. It's just a matter of that maximum size of the 5,000 square cubits, and that it's properly enclosed. And from Rabbi Yosef, we learned that it doesn't have to be in a square shape. Rabbi Akiva had said it was 70 and a fraction times 70 and a fraction, right? 70 by 70, a very square kind of shape. But Rabbi Yosef said, no, it doesn't have to be a square shape. It's just that maximum size, 5,000 square cubits, and properly enclosed. Today, we're going to look at an exception to that rule and what its ramifications are. So, let's say that there was a courtyard that was originally attached to a dwelling, and then the dwelling was destroyed and it was never rebuilt. So we already learned that a courtyard that is attached to a dwelling that does have residential purposes can be much bigger than that 5,000 square cubit size. So if this thing, so when it was the courtyard of a house, of a dwelling, there was a dwelling in this large enclosure, so it was okay to carry on Shabbos throughout that enclosure. Remember, what we're talking about in terms of these maximum sizes of this enclosure is that we can carry there on Shabbos, right? It's not, it doesn't mean that it's some other kind of domain, like a public domain way out there in the fields or a Carmelis. It's going to be a place that's going to be permitted to carry on Shabbos, like in a private domain. That's why it has this maximum size. But if it's a courtyard that is attached to a dwelling, as we saw, it can be much larger than that 5,000 square cubit maximum. Also, if there was a caravan on the road and they stopped to camp and it was a big caravan, they're going to camp during Shabbos, they can enclose sort of the area of the caravan, even though it's larger than that 5,000 square cubit limit. Okay, so here we have this enclosure. There used to be a dwelling on it. It's much larger than the 5,000 square cubits. It was permitted to carry there because it was a residential enclosure. But now the dwelling that made it a residential enclosure is gone. It was destroyed. It wasn't rebuilt. Can we carry there? Answer, yes. We can carry there because it was originally designated as a residential enclosure. Let me just look at my notes. Yes, the original designation means that we can still carry there even if the dwelling is gone. However, there are other things that can happen within this enclosure that are going to lead to its losing that validity for carrying there on Shabbos. Namely, if we started planting seeds in it, if we sow seeds in that enclosure, if we planted more than half of it, right? This thing is all, we know that it's bigger than the 5,000 square cubits. We can also refer to this as 2 base sa. So 2 base sa, meaning the amount of land necessary to grow 2 measures of grain. Same thing as the 5,000 square cubits. So we know it's larger than that. If we actually plant seeds in it, and we start growing plants in that enclosure, and we keep planting, just a few plants in the corner, nothing's going to change. But if we keep adding to the planted area in this enclosure, it was originally designated as a residential area, so it was okay to carry there on Shabbos. But if we plant the majority of it, right? So in other words, if we plant anything more than half of that enclosure, if we sow seeds there, so now the majority of that enclosure has been turned into a garden or a field, as it were, a place where we're growing seed crops, and it's going to lose its designation as residential. It won't be residential anymore. Now it's a productive place for growing crops, and that's a workplace, not a living place, and we're not going to be permitted to carry there on Shabbos because it's larger than that maximum size. Even though it was originally designated as residential, it's going to lose that designation when we plant more of it, crops, seed plants, over more than half of the enclosure. Very good. We understand. What if we don't plant corn or even geraniums? What if we plant trees? So trees are going to have a different meaning in this discussion than other kinds of plants. Why? Because trees can be ornamental, right? So if more than half of it was originally designated for residential, and now it's got a bunch of trees in it, so we're still going to be able to carry. Trees are going to be different than plants. If they're trees, we can carry, unless it's an orchard, right? If they're fruit trees, olive trees, almond or cashew trees, so then again, it's becoming a productive area where we're growing a crop that just happens to grow on trees. It's an orchard. We're not going to be able to carry there on Shabbos. But if they're merely decorative trees, so that's something else. What's interesting is, well, what if they're ornamental plants that cover more than half of it? That wasn't mentioned by the sages in our discussion, but I get the feeling that they said trees, they didn't say ornamental plants. So even if they're plants that, they're not berries, they're not cotton, they're not, they're not something to eat, nevertheless, if there's so many plants over this large area that covers so much of it, there's the possibility that what we're growing is the plants, right? We could grow the plants and then transfer the plants somewhere else. So even though the plants themselves might be ornamental in nature, it seems that if more than half of the field is planted in them, it's going to lose its designation as residential. We can't carry there. That's what I'm guessing. That's just simply not addressed in our daf. But for sure, in terms of trees, we can still carry if more than half of this enclosure is planted with trees, unless it's an orchard type situation. Okay. Rav Huna adds the qualification that Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua, that even if we've planted less than half of this field with our seed crops, right? Like, let's say we're planted in cucumbers and tomatoes, but we didn't plant them over more than half of the field. It was less than half of this enclosure. But this enclosure, remember, it might have been very large to begin with because it was originally attached to a residential dwelling. And that's why we could carry there, and we can still carry there even though the dwelling is gone. So he points out that even if we add plants now to less than half of the enclosure, but the part that is planted amounts to more than the 5,000 square cubit limit, more than 2 base sub, which is another way to say the same thing, then again, the whole enclosure is going to lose that permission to carry there on Shabbos. With respect to trees, Rav Yehuda said in the name of Avimi that the way we know that these trees are ornamental and therefore we can carry in that courtyard is that they're arranged in rows, right? So even if it's not an orchard situation, it's not trees that are going to produce fruit or nuts or olives or something, they're just ornamental, but to confirm that they're ornamental, they need to be planted in rows But Rav Nachman is going to say, no, you don't have to plant them in rows. If it's not an orchard, it's not an orchard. The trees don't have to be arranged in rows for them to count as ornamental. Therefore, as long as it's not an orchard, not productive trees, they're just beautiful trees, they don't have to be planted in rows, and this enclosure can retain its residential nature, and we can carry within it on Shabbos. Okay, this is all a discussion so far of an enclosure that was originally attached to a dwelling. And so even though it was larger than that maximum size for a non-dwelling enclosure, now that the dwelling is gone, we can still carry there. Right. What if we have an enclosure like this that was originally created not to be attached to a dwelling? It was just some kind of enclosure out in the fields. Sometimes you're driving out in the middle of nowhere, and somebody has some private property out there, but there's no home. So it's just a field separated from the other fields. Somebody owns it. It's been enclosed, but there's no home out there. It was never residential in nature. And it's larger than 5,000 square cubits. So we know we cannot carry in that enclosure. Is there a way to turn that enclosure into a place that's residential in nature and we can carry there? I mean, the first thing you'd say is, well, build a hut within it, right? Build some kind of a structure. But apparently that's not going to be enough, because even though you've added such a structure, when that enclosure was built, it was not residential in nature. So you're going to have to make an adjustment to the enclosure itself, to the fence, to the partition that surrounds that enclosure in order to make it residential in nature. Because even if you add that house, because the enclosure was originally built for a non-residential purpose, we still are not going to be able to carry there on Shabbos. I'm glad you're adding questions and comments. I got a little while to go, but not that long, and then I'll come to your questions and comments. Okay. So the question is, this fence that was originally built for another reason, non-residential, how do we adjust it so that we're going to be able to carry in this courtyard? This is an enclosure, right? This is not an alley within the city where so much of our original discussion was when we started this track day. We're not going to be able to just add a side post somewhere. We have to do something to this fence. So Rav Nachman says, in the name of Shmuel, how do you adjust this fence? You have to breach at least 10 cubits of the fence. In other words, you have to tear down at least 10 cubits of the fence and then build back a little bit of what you tore down and leave an entrance that's 10 cubits or less wide. I mean, an opening that's 10 cubits or less wide, which now constitutes an entrance, right? Before it was just an enclosure. Now it's an enclosure with an entrance. And when you tore down more than 10 cubits, it's like now you had no enclosure, right? The partition was no longer valid as an enclosure because it has a breach more than 10 cubits wide. So it's as if you tore down the whole fence. When you rebuild the part that you tore down, you leave an opening, a purposeful opening that's 10 cubits or less. Now that counts as an entrance, and it's like you've redesignated the whole thing. You didn't have to tear down all of the fence around the whole enclosure, just this part of it where you tore down more than 10 cubits, built some back up, and left an entrance. Now it's residential in nature. So now we get a very Talmudic question. Well, what if you didn't tear down, let's say, the 11 cubits that you needed to tear down? Rather, you tore down 1 cubit and then you fixed it. And then you tore down another cubit and then you fixed it. Maybe you didn't want to leave such a big opening. Maybe you were keeping animals there and they would run away. Or you were storing something and you wanted to keep animals out of that area. So you didn't want to leave a big breach overnight. So instead, you just tore down 1 cubit at a time. Maybe you plugged it with something and then you rebuilt it, right? And then, so going 1 cubit at a time, tear down, rebuild, tear down, rebuild. And so you've only, at any one time, there was only an opening of 1 cubit, but you replaced more than 10 cubits of the fence. Did we re-designate that whole fence as an enclosure around a residential area when we didn't tear down the 11 cubits at once, but only replaced 1 cubit at a time. To help us understand the answer to that question, our sages are going to look at another area of the law, and we've seen this before. We looked at it in Tractate Shabbos, where you had a wooden utensil, let's say a wooden bowl, and a wooden bowl, it's possible that it becomes tameh. It can become ritually impure through contact with some source of impurity, like a sheretz, a creeping thing, or something else. And then we learned that if it has a hole the size of a pomegranate in that bowl, so it's no longer a bowl. So once it has a hole, that you've made a hole in that bowl the size of a pomegranate, it's like you've changed its nature. You've destroyed it as a bowl. It can't hold things in it. It can't even hold pomegranates because it has a hole the size of a pomegranate. So since it's no longer a bowl, it no longer retains that ritual impurity that it contracted when it touched a source of impurity. So it's now pure. In other words, now it's tahor because it's no longer the bowl that it was. So the question was asked in that case, well, what if you don't make a hole the size of a pomegranate? What if you only make a little hole the size of an olive and you fix it? And then you make another hole the size of an olive and then you fix it. And another olive-sized hole and you fix it. And eventually, just one little hole at a time, you replace as much of that bowl as if it had had a pomegranate-sized hole. Did you essentially create a new bowl which no longer carries the impurity that the old bowl had? And to help us understand that question, we looked at a sandal, right? So a sandal, if you break one strap of a sandal, so you fix the sandal, you fix that one strap. But if you have a sandal that both straps are broken, there's no way to use that sandal. And by the time you fix the second strap, it's like you have a new sandal, because in between, it just couldn't be used as a sandal. It was dreck, it was nothing, it was garbage. So if the sandal had some kind of impurity and then one strap at a time was broken, so then once you fix the second strap, it's like you have a new sandal. And that teaching, Hezekiah taught about the bowl to his student, Rabbi Yochanan. Then he was a little confused about the sandal, because the problem is, like, what if the front of the sandal transmits its impurity to the back of the sandal? And he was a little unsure what to do with it. And Rabbi Yochanan sort of helped his teacher figure it out using the example of the bowl. And that these little incremental changes, at a certain point, you will arrive at a new entity. That's the way it was put. So anybody who studied a little bit of Hegel in college, you might have heard this phrase that we have quantitative incremental changes that eventually lead to a qualitative difference, right? The classic example of that is you have water, and you keep adding just a little bit of heat, a little bit of heat, a little bit of heat. You just keep adding heat 1 degree at a time, and it's just water, it's water, it's water, it's water. But eventually you add just one more little bit of heat, one more little calorie of heat, and then it boils, and now it's turning into a gas, right? So you only added 1 calorie of heat, the same calorie that took that water from, in fact, well, let's work in centigrade, that took it from 98 degrees to 99 degrees. It didn't make any change, same as the 1 calorie you added that took it from 88 degrees to 89 degrees. But when you add a calorie that it takes it from 99 degrees to 100 degrees, it boils, and that liquid becomes a gas, a quantitative change that produces a qualitative difference. Marx and Engels, who invented communism, basically, they actually seized on that idea, and they said, well, if a man keeps acquiring money, at a certain point, he goes from a man with money to a capitalist, and therefore he's an oppressor. I'm not going to get into the politics of communism, except to say that my mother and my grandmother and her family suffered quite a bit in Soviet Hungary from the ideal vision of communism, which was, when it was practiced in the real world, was an oppressive horror. So enough about that. The better example, let's say, for these quantitative differences that produce the qualitative change is adding a little bit of heat to water. Okay. And so now we come back to, hold on, let me just find my way here. Yes, so exactly. So with the fence around the enclosure, it's going to work. You can tear down just a little bit of fence at a time and fix it. And by the time you get to where you've replaced more than 10 cubits of the fence, it's going to be as if you opened up, or let's say 11 cubits of the fence. It's as if you tore down the 11 and replaced it. And it counts that like the whole enclosure now is a new enclosure, and you're able to redesignate that yard, that carpet, as if you will, that was never built as residential. Now it can count as residential. I mean, you're still going to need some other element that makes it residential, like there's going to be a structure there. You're going to have some other element that makes it more like residential than what it was built. You have to have some intentionality that the reason you're replacing this fence is so that it has a residential nature. It's not just the fence that you've changed. Okay. Good. So we covered that. And now we have another question. What if, okay, so we're back to the first example of the enclosure that was built to be residential, right? So it's larger than the 5,000 square cubits. It was originally built for the purpose of accompanying a residence. The residence is gone. We can still carry there on Shabbos. If we planted more than half of it with a seed crop, now we can't carry there on Shabbos, okay? What if that enclosure, that land within the enclosure becomes flooded? What if water comes into this field? Does the water change its nature? Is it going to somehow take it from a place where it's permitted to carry because it was originally residential, and now we won't be permitted to carry because of all this water that has entered the enclosure? What's the answer to that? Very interesting. The water is considered beneficial to the owner of the land, right? So we can almost think about, I mean, it's not farmland, right? There has to have this residential quality to it. So we're not going to think about a rice paddy in China where it gets fully flooded. But this is more like, it's really high-end property and it's going to have a pond. I'm almost thinking of Bill Murray and Chevy Chase talking to Bill Murray in the movie Caddyshack, if you remember that. He's very rich and he says, well, we got a pool and a pond. The pond's good for you, he says to Bill Murray. But this idea that you would have water on your property, that's good. It's good for the owner. Can you have too much water on your property? Obviously. But the sages are going to, allow you to have quite a bit of water on that land before it's going to destroy its residential nature. How much? Really, it can cover a huge amount. It can pretty much cover all of the land. It can even be more than 10 handbreadths deep, 10 tefachim deep. But the key is that the water has to be potable, drinkable. It has to be fit for human consumption. If it's not fit for human consumption and it's more than 10 handbreadths deep, it's like that much water that's coming to your land and it's not good for you that it's on your land. Okay, so that's going to destroy the residential nature of the enclosure, and then we're no longer going to be we're not going to be permitted to carry there on Shabbos. Before I go to your questions, I'll just tell one little story briefly because I was so reminded of this question. In a sense, these are zoning questions, right? So what is the intended use of the land is going to affect, the law that applies on that land, at least when it comes to Shabbos and whether we're allowed to carry there. So a long time ago, I was doing research for a script that I was writing, and it was a story that took place in the wine country. In Napa and Sonoma, California. And so I went up there, I met a member of the film commission, and then they made introductions, and I spent a day interviewing owners of vineyards, wineries, wine land up there in Sonoma and Napa. One of the guys that I met has become very successful. I guess I won't mention his name. It's nothing critical of him, but just so I'm sure not to commit lashon hara, gossiping, talking about other people. I'll just say it was a winery owner in the wine country of California who has since become hugely successful. His name and his wines are in every supermarket in America. But at that time, he'd only been at it for maybe 5 or 10 years. And what was so interesting was he had bought this parcel of land. It was a few hundred acres. And it was sort of in two parts. It was a hillside and a flat. So there was a flat area at the bottom of a hillside. And he didn't want, in the beginning, he didn't have the resources to plant all of the land. So he started by planting his vines, his wine vines, his grapevines on the hillside. And, he arranged all his rows and he arranged his irrigation and he was watering his vines, etc. Now, when you water your vines on that hillside, some of that water is going to run down the hill and it's going to collect at the bottom of the hill in that flat area. Now, he was certainly planning to eventually expand his operation and plant the flat area as well as the hillside. But he hadn't gotten there yet. So for those first few years of his operation, water from his hillside vines was collecting in the flat area and just kind of standing there. And it caused some wild grasses to grow among that, in that water that was standing in the flat area. He wasn't doing anything with it, so he just let it be. The water kind of collected there. It became marshy. And because you now had a marsh in a nice, beautiful area of Northern California, it attracted birds and other wildlife to this area. And next thing you know, it becomes a pretty wetland, which would be a nice feature of his property, just for those years until he's ready to plant his grapes there. Except that the state of California came in and said, that is a wetland. It's now a protected area, and you can't plant there. Now, there was no wetland until he started growing his vines and watering them on the hillside. And now the state is coming in and telling him that half of his property, which, would have tremendous value to him once his operation became big enough, and it certainly eventually became big enough for him to expand the grape growing area throughout the flat area. And it just became a huge problem to him that he had, inadvertently, accidentally, if you will, created a little marshland at the foot of his terraced vines. It was a huge problem for him. And when I met him, he was in a big fight with the state to sort of get the rights back to his own land. And he did, I assume, eventually, or maybe he bought neighboring plots. I don't know. But eventually became super successful. So I guess it worked out okay for him. But it's just so interesting how policymakers, who want to do good, right? Protecting wildlife in California is a beautiful value. We want to protect it for our descendants. We want to make sure that, all this beautiful land and that these animals that are endangered have a place to thrive so that our children, our children's children, and their children can enjoy wildlife in California. But you have to balance that value against protecting the property rights of a person who bought property that was nothing there. He started developing it so that it could grow grapes there. And then the state came in and told him what he could or couldn't do with his land. Now, the sages are not doing that, right? They're not coming in and telling you what you can and can't plant in your garden as some kind of governmental authority. What they're telling you is how you have to address your land if you want to conduct yourself as a person of faith who wants to fulfill his obligations and not violate prohibitions as laid out for us in the Torah. So it's definitely a different kind of system of weighing values, but you can see how when you're talking about land use, you get very interesting questions of policy that come up. Okay, let's look at some questions. Okay, so let's see. Gwen Strong asks, how much is one measure? So when we're talking about a measure of grain, there's a sa and there's a core. I don't know how to translate that into, like cubic volume of barley or wheat and stuff. But when we're talking about enough land to grow 2 measures of grain, it's like, what are you going to then do with it? I mean, a sa, when we're talking about 2 base sa, right? So like enough land to grow 2 measures of grain. It's not very big, right? Farms are big, right? So a sa, it's not really that much, like when but it's concentrated, right? A sa, when you talk about a mikvah, the minimum size of a mikvah in which a person can immerse in water in order to purify themselves if they've contracted a ritual impurity, let's say by touching a dead person or a creeping thing. So the minimum mikvah is about the size of a bathtub. It's just enough to get your whole body underwater, and that contains 40 sa. Right, so now we're talking about just 2. It's not that big. It's like a few bushels, but it takes that much land to create. It's not that big, right? It's about 100 feet by 100 feet. So it's almost like a regular size backyard in the suburbs, or maybe 2 backyards, is going to produce that much grain. But this is for sure not my area of expertise. Bill Eldridge, question about the planting. Say that the person who plants a few plants in the corner of the plot that was residential in the beginning does so fully expecting the crops to grow in the fullness of time and of their own accord. I'm asking because my family are currently discussing permaculture options for what to do with my family farm once my grandmother moves closer to my mother. If the hypothetical gardener had such an enclosure and decided to do a food forest or a permaculture garden, and in time the plants, simply behaving as they do in the wild, will fill the enclosure, has the gardener changed the status of the space? Does it only change if said gardener did it intentionally, or even if he did it accidentally? What a great question. I don't know. They were definitely talking about planting half of the space, in an area that was not that was residential in nature. Now it's going to be converted into more of a farm, like a working area. But if he planted it knowing that the plants would eventually overtake half of it, because we also had a similar question, like if he plants thorns. Right, if he plants weeds, it's just something kind of to look at. He wants a little bit of a meadow type of look. That's going to be different. That has an intentionality associated with it. And most people don't care about thorns, but we read that in Arabia they do use thorns, a plant called thorns, in order to feed their camels. I don't know, Bill. I don't know. It's a great question. I think it has to do with intentionality and what you can expect. And since you know that it's going to grow over half the field, and you want it to grow over half the field, and you're even going to extract food from it, seems like probably it will remove the residential nature of it. But again, this is just for the purpose of a Jew carrying on Shabbos, right? If you're a non-Jew, this doesn't affect you because you can carry on Shabbos. But if you're talking about a Jew, who wants to have this plot of land and carry there. And then the question is, why do you care? Why do you want to be able to carry there on Shabbos? That's another important question. You don't live there, right? We're talking about this area that's not residential anymore, even if it was so at one time. So, sort of figuring this out. There is this case that's given on this page of a yard in Pum, which was not residential. It was connected on one side to an alley and on the other side to a path through a vineyard down to a river. And they wanted to be able to carry there, and they went through a sort of a big thought process of how they would do that. Eventually, they didn't want to put an entrance. They didn't want to convert the end of the path that touches the river with putting some kind of a partition there, because the river itself is a partition. They wanted to make an adjustment, but you can't make an adjustment over a partition that's already there and is still there, meaning the river. They thought to make an adjustment where the path through the vineyard meets the enclosure, and they used camels in this enclosure. And they said, well, these camels, that come to the enclosure to pick up what's stored there. They're going to knock down that entrance. And in the end, they figured that a side post between the alley and the enclosure was going to work. My point is not to go through that whole incident, but to say that they had to really figure out not only what is the enclosure, how is the enclosure used, what kinds of adjustments could be made, but also how it will be used, and how those adjustments that they make will be perceived by the people who own it and the people who live nearby. So the sages are always being careful that if we make an adjustment in this case and people see it and they misunderstand what we're doing, we have to guard against that, lest they take our example, understand it improperly, and then go and make a mistake and a transgression because of their misunderstanding. Okay, next question. Mark Price. This might seem like neurotic town planning regulations to some people, but philosophical issues behind it are fascinating. Exactly. The whole ship of Odysseus problem. If I replace one plank of a boat or a fence, is it the same fence or boat? Huge issues of the balance between being and becoming. I like that very much, Mark. Right? And so that same idea that we talked about, the Hegelian question, right? You just keep making little changes, and then, as Rabbi Yochanan said, at what point does the new entity arrive? And that's a very tough question, because at what point can we say, okay, when a liquid turns into a gas, that seems like a good hard boundary. But if we don't have such a clear qualitative transformation, when does it happen? I believe that this kind of reasoning also enters developmental psychology. And like children, they have little changes, and then at a certain point, the personality changes or the adult arrives. There's a lot to weigh in understanding when those things happen. I'm just reminded there was also something, I remember hearing it in college, I don't even remember what it was, but I think it was the theory of a famous child psychiatrist who said that, as we become our professions, in the beginning, we're playing a part. It's like you go to law school, that doesn't make you a lawyer. You take the bar, it doesn't really make you a lawyer. And now you start working and you feel like you're playing a role. You're not really a lawyer. You feel like you're faking it. You feel like, do these people really believe me that I'm a lawyer? But you keep doing the work, and then one day you're a lawyer. Right? And like, when did that really happen? Hard to say. There were little quantitative changes. Okay. So I understand, says Patrice Carter, when I plant vegetables in my backyard, I cannot enter it on Shabbat. No, I wouldn't say that. Because your backyard, for sure, is part of your residential area. So the fact that some little part of it has vegetables, it's not going to disqualify the whole backyard. Should you walk among the vegetables? That's an interesting question. I don't have the answer at hand. It seems to me that since you're gardening there, right, since you work the land to grow vegetables during the week, probably you don't want to enter that part of your yard on Shabbos because, what do you do there? You work there. It's not a Shabbostic area of your property, it seems to me. Bill Eldridge said, no, because you still live there, I think. Exactly. Answering Patrice. Mark Price says, like Bill said, I think the point is that it's your backyard and it's not intended to be a commercial farm. Exactly. And Sandy McMurray says, my understanding is you could go in your backyard, but you cannot harvest the vegetables on Shabbos. That's for sure. Very good, Sandy. For sure, we've already seen in Tractate Shabbos that one thing you cannot do on Shabbos is cut any kind of a limb of a living thing, of any plant, right? You can't take a cherry, not even one cherry, off a tree. We have a little rosemary bush, and sometimes we like to take a sprig of rosemary off that bush and put it in a gin and tonic, for example. Not on Shabbos. You can't harvest at all. You can't cut any living thing from its source on Shabbos, because that is the melacha, the forbidden labor, prohibited labor on Shabbos of harvesting. Okay, that's what I've got for us this evening. Hopefully this led us to think. Again, so much of this tractate, it's about, right, is we want to create holiness in the space around us that takes planning and thinking it through and understanding what is intended by the spaces around us, how we've set them up during the week so that we're prepared to understand what what's permitted and what's prohibited on Shabbos. Everything, right, in Eruvin and Shabbos, it's like the whole week is setting us up for Shabbos. And that's really a good way to think of it. We should enjoy our work. We should love what we do. We should be productive and creative. But we don't get to really enjoy the fruits of our labors until we can sit back like God did on the seventh day and say, okay, the working is done and the enjoyment is here. May you have a great evening. And it's Wednesday, so we can already say good Shabbos. And by the way, the sun is not set yet. And I have not, because I did, if you didn't hear today, we had a beautiful conversation on AT Live this morning with David Efune, the editor-in-chief and CEO of the Allgemeiner, one of the leading Jewish publications in the world. If you missed that conversation, it's well worth catching. We discussed anti-Semitism, philo-Semitism, the role of Israel in the world, the role of the Jewish people, all kinds of subjects from a journalist's perspective. David is a really brilliant commenter on modern society. But what I didn't do this morning is blow the shofar. So let's do that. We're blowing it because we're in the month of Elul, the last month of the year, as we're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah. Have a great evening.